The problems just seem to keep piling up for Chevrolet and GMC this year. If you own a Chevy or are thinking about buying one, then you might want to think again, at least for right now. We are going to begin here tonight with the sweeping changes coming to America's biggest automaker. General Motors said today it is cutting close to 14,000 jobs, including 15% of its salaried workforce. Chevrolet has just pulled the plug on its U.S. production, and the shock is reverberating across America. Plants in Michigan, Texas, and Missouri, once roaring with the sound of assembly lines, now stand silent. This wasn't a gradual slowdown. It was an abrupt halt that struck at the heart of GM's most profitable vehicles, the Silverado, the Tahoe, the Blazer. Billions of dollars in output evaporated overnight, leaving workers and suppliers stunned. For tens of thousands of employees, the reality was brutal. Shifts were canceled, paychecks disappeared, and entire workers and towns left in crisis households were thrown into crisis. The ripples spread fast. Contractors, suppliers, and transport workers suddenly found themselves with nothing to move, nothing to deliver, and no way to cover their bills. Communities built around these factories, Flint in Michigan, Toledo, and Ohio, are now watching shops close, families default on mortgages, and a deep unease settle in. What happens to a town when its largest employer walks away without warning? And the bigger question is this: is Chevrolet's shutdown a temporary tremor, or the first crack in the foundation of American manufacturing itself? Before we begin, hit that like button if you're finding this eye-opening. It really helps us beat the algorithm. If the shock inside the factories was devastating, the reaction on Wall Street told a very different story. Investors initially cheered the announcement, praising GM for protecting shareholder value, even as thousands of families were losing their livelihoods. In the hours that followed, GM's stock price swung wildly. It surged when analysts framed the cuts as a bold financial strategy. But the optimism didn't last. When the reality of collapsing profits set in, the stock tumbled nearly 7%, wiping out billions in market value and exposing the fragility behind the celebration. Meanwhile, on the ground, workers saw none of the silver linings. For them, this wasn't about stock charts. It was about survival. The Wall Street cheers, then crash's closure, was branded a betrayal of the very promise of Made in America, and anger spread quickly through the ranks of GM's unionized workforce. The United Auto Workers Union responded with rolling protests threatening to escalate into a nationwide strike. Across factory towns, picket signs lined the streets, echoing decades of industrial unrest that many had hoped belonged to history. And it wasn't just workers. Consumers joined the backlash, returning vehicles, canceling orders, and fueling a growing boycott movement. For GM, the trust deficit was widening, not only with its employees but with the very customers it relied on. If you've made it this far, you probably care. Consider subscribing to stay updated. But behind the anger on factory floors and the turmoil in financial markets lies the spark that ignited it all: Washington's tariff war. What began as a promise to protect American industry quickly turned into the very force that pushed it to the edge. The Trump administration's decision to impose a 25% tariff on imported cars and auto parts didn't just rattle foreign competitors, it hit the U.S. auto industry itself with crushing force. Analysts estimate the global sector has already absorbed nearly $12 billion in losses, and the ripple is still spreading. For GM, the impact was immediate. The company booked a $1.1 billion hit in the second quarter alone, with forecasts warning of as much as $5 billion in annual losses if the tariffs continue. Tariffs hit GM's supply chain. Ford, facing the same reality, issued its own warning: billions of dollars in industry-wide profit could vanish overnight. And for American consumers, the costs are no longer abstract. The average price of a new vehicle is projected to climb by $300, while large pickups, the very backbone of U.S. sales, could soar by as much as $1,000. What was supposed to be protection now looks like a hidden tax reshaping both the industry's balance sheets and the budgets of ordinary households. The real damage of tariffs isn't just in headline numbers, it's in the hidden arteries of the supply chain. Even cars proudly assembled in America aren't spared because their lifeblood flows through parts that cross borders again and again. Take the Chevrolet Silverado. On paper, it's an American-made truck. In practice, its engine components, electronics, and steel frames flow in from Mexico, Canada, Germany, and Japan. From Mexico alone, nearly $30 billion worth of parts make their way into GM's assembly lines each year. Every crossing now comes with a price tag, turning once smooth supply chains into bureaucratic nightmares. What used to be a finely tuned system of just-in-time deliveries has become a maze of paperwork, fees, and uncertainty. Each component is taxed not once, but multiple times as it travels back and forth across borders, inflating costs and delaying production. For companies that once relied on efficiency as their greatest weapon, it feels like fighting with one hand tied behind their back. GM's CEO Mary Barra has openly admitted the company is running contingency scenarios to soften the blow. Yet in public, GM strikes a different tone, thanking the administration for its support of the auto industry, even as the policies themselves leave the company scrambling for survival. Faced with mounting losses and a supply chain strangled by tariffs, GM had little choice but to redraw its entire production map. Survival meant making moves that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. The company began by slashing nearly a third of its price shock for American buyers' overseas inventory, a desperate attempt to dodge immediate tariff costs. What had once been a global footprint designed for efficiency suddenly became a liability, forcing GM to cut deep just to keep balance sheets stable. Then came the controversial pivot-shifting production of flagship models like the Silverado and Blazer to Mexico and South Korea, where labor costs are up to 70% lower than in the United States. For American workers, the decision felt like abandonment. For GM's executives, it was a calculation of survival in a system that punished every domestic move. Yet, even as GM pulled back, it dangled the promise of return. A $4 billion investment was announced to reintroduce the Blazer and Equinox to U.S. assembly lines by 2027, adding an estimated 3,000 vehicles per year once the projects come online. In the meantime, GM has increased output at its Fort Wayne plant in Indiana, an attempt to reassure both consumers and policymakers that the company still intends to keep one foot firmly planted in American soil. But beneath the promises lies a hard truth. GM's strategy is no longer about loyalty to place but about survival in a battlefield where every border crossing has become a financial ambush. As American factories went dark, Mexico quickly became the new battleground for GM's future. Plants like the one in Silo, long a cornerstone of the company's North American strategy, suddenly found themselves carrying the weight of production that once defined Made in America. Production shifts abroad, but the bargain came at a price. Workers in Salo earn as little as $5.50 an hour wages that are a fraction of their U.S. counterparts. For GM, that gap is the lifeline keeping margins alive under tariff pressure. For workers, it's a symbol of exploitation fueling anger and resentment that have been simmering for years. When labor organizers pushed for a raise, GM flatly refused, pointing to tariffs as the excuse. Executives argued that higher wages would threaten profitability, a claim that deepened the sense of betrayal among employees already struggling to survive on bare minimum pay. The stakes stretch beyond the factory floor. If GM shutters or scales back Mexican plants in response to political pressure, it risks unleashing a wave of unemployment that could accelerate migration north. What began as a corporate adjustment has the potential to spill over into regional instability, pulling governments into the conflict. Now GM finds itself caught in a vice. On one side, American unions accuse it of abandoning domestic workers. On the other, Mexican labor groups are threatening strikes unless wages rise. The company that once defined industrial power is now cornered by unrest on both sides of the border. The crisis was never going to stay confined within U.S. borders. What started as a tariff dispute inside America quickly escalated into a global flashpoint, pulling governments and rival automakers into the storm. From Washington, the threats grew sharper. Global rivals seize opportunity. President Trump floated the idea of slapping a 100% tariff on Chevrolet vehicles produced abroad. A move designed to force GM back onto U.S. soil, but one that risked igniting a trade war with America's closest partners. Ottawa and Mexico City wasted no time signaling their readiness to retaliate. Canadian officials hinted at new protectionist measures targeting U.S. auto exports, while Mexico prepared its own countermeasures to defend the very plants GM had just shifted south. What was once an integrated North American supply chain was now fragmenting under political fire, and the shockwaves extended even further. In Beijing, Chinese authorities imposed fresh tariffs on U.S.-made SUVs and pickups, choking off Cadillac exports, just as the brand was trying to establish itself in one of the world's largest markets. For GM, it was another door slammed shut. Meanwhile, European and Asian competitors seized the moment with American manufacturers paralyzed by tariffs and uncertainty. Rivals from Germany, South Korea, and Japan stepped in to capture market share, positioning themselves as reliable suppliers in an industry suddenly reshaped by politics. What began as a battle over auto parts had now become a global contest for dominance, one where GM looked less like the aggressor and more like collateral damage. Chevrolet's collapse is more than a corporate setback. It's a siren for the future of American manufacturing. This isn't just about one company's miscalculation, but about the unraveling of an entire promise that once defined the U.S. economy. Final warning: can U.S. rebuild? The true losers are not investors on Wall Street who can hedge their bets and pivot portfolios, but the workers and communities left behind. Families that trusted Made in America as a guarantee of stability are now watching that trust fracture in real time. Protectionism was sold as a shield. Instead, it has cut both ways, strangling supply chains, driving up costs, and forcing companies to look abroad for survival. Every new tariff has become another crack in the foundation, leaving the dream of domestic industrial strength weaker, not stronger. And now the question hangs heavy. Is this a temporary shock that America can recover from, or the beginning of a slow, irreversible decline of its industrial power in the age of protectionism? That's where we leave today's story. On a crossroads between resilience and decline, will the United States rebuild its manufacturing backbone, or will other nations permanently seize the space it once dominated? The answer will define not only the auto industry, but America's place in the global economy.
Thanks for sticking around if you found this valuable. Like and subscribe to support more content like this.